11th, 2000, at 6:07 a.m., the defendant, Dawan Ferguson, a 911 call, heard at the intersection of Page and Skinker, just inside the city limits of St. Louis. When he made that call, he reported to the police that his 1999 Maroon Expedition had just been carjacked with his 9-year-old son, Christian, inside. This 911 call sparked extensive law enforcement involvement, media coverage, organized searches. It became known as the disappearance of Christian Ferguson. Christian Ferguson has never been recovered. But the evidence that you will see this week show to you that Christian Ferguson was never missing, and that 911 call placed by the defendant was not true. The evidence will show that, and it will show that it was all a cover-up by the defendant to cover up the murder of his own child. Christian Ferguson suffered from a genetic dyslipidemia. You'll hear from doctors and witnesses that will explain to you, but overall it means that his body couldn't process proteins like a normal person could. Medication, sustaining medication, and he had to undergo strict dietary restrictions. Only a few grams of protein he could have per day. You will hear that if he followed that diet and he received medication, he would appear just like a normal child. You saw that video. Christian Ferguson looked like any other little boy, walking, talking, playing around with his family. You wouldn't know that he had some sort of genetic disorder. You will hear from Theda Person, who is Christian's mother. You'll hear from his sister, Lynn, who formerly identified as Connor Ferguson. We talked about that in jury selection. You'll hear from his aunt, Sharon, and they will all talk to you about what Christian's life was like as he was growing up. And then everything changed for Christian in January of 2001, January 16th of 2001 specifically. You will hear that defendant Dawan Ferguson had full and physical custody of Christian during this time. January 16th of 2001, Christian had to go to the hospital. Here is that both the defendant and were well instructed by doctors on what to keep an eye out for with Christian. If his skin or if something happened, his body would start to rise. And when those levels started to rise, that put him at risk for falling into a coma, brain damage, in his. They were trained on what to look at: confusion, lethargy, not acting right, vomiting, things like that. Stuff that, if that happened to a normal child, a parent would closely monitor, but it might not automatically result in a trip to the emergency room. That was not the case for Christian Ferguson. If something like that, these outward symptoms were being displayed, they were to take him in to see his doctor. Well, on the evening of January 15th, 2001, Christian started getting sick. From the defendant's own words, he was vomiting. The defendant didn't take him to the hospital. Instead, he put him in his bedroom and to sleep. The next morning, in the 10 o'clock hour, is when he decides to make that call. At the ER until closer to noon. By this point, Christian Ferguson's coma, suffered extensive brain injury, was hospitalized for months. His life changed, and that is when Christian Ferguson became the disabled little boy that everyone heard about on the news. He never needed to get to that point. His parents were instructed for it. After he suffered a coma, he couldn't walk, couldn't talk. He couldn't restroom anymore. He had to go back into diapers, and he had that feeding tube inserted in which he received most nutrient and his medication. No longer that little boy you all just saw on that video. So during this time period, starting in January of 2001, leading into June of 2003, is the charged time period. And the defendant is now standing trial for his actions and inactions during that time by failing to provide Christian Ferguson with proper nutrition and medication. And all they caused his death. So let's flash forward. You will hear that the Fergusons had in-home nurses were provided to them by Medicaid. You will hear from two of them. Let's start with Tredell Day. She was an at-home nurse in the Ferguson household. They worked 40 hours a week. That was it. When they weren't there, Christian was under of his father. Tredell Day will get in here and she will tell you that when she would go to get Christian in the morning, he'd be filthy. She would have to give him a bath before she would take him out of the house to her home. She would provide him food because it wasn't being provided in the home. Christian off at the end of her shift and show up the next day. He would still be in the same outfit. He would be in double-wrapped, urine-soaked diapers that had never been changed. She will tell you that she would measure out and mix up the amount of formula that he would need for that in-between time period when she wasn't there. And the next day, a lot of it, meaning Christian never received it, she would keep an eye on the medicine and would notice that it didn't change between when she would leave and when she would come back, meaning Christian wasn't getting it. Tredell Day will tell you a lot about what she observed in that home and the treatment Christian was receiving. From Kim Nelson now. She was the last at-home nurse that was in the Ferguson household. She will tell you that she had to perform several functions that weren't necessarily required of them, such as ordering the medicines, because the defendant didn't do it. She will tell you that in February, leading into March of 2003, she went to go get the order, and the doctors wouldn't sign off on the prescription because they had not seen Christian Ferguson in over a year. You will hear from his doctors. You will hear from his dietitian. Chris is supposed to be seen regularly. Nancy Brody, his dietitian, will say she actually wanted to see him monthly.
Welcome back, Amanda. I figured I'm going to restart it and delete the other one.
For follow-up
court TV,
appointments.
so I can't be straight.
They went unanswered. So when Kim Nero went to go get this prescription ordered and was told this, they said, "We won't do it until we see Christian and can check on him." Kim Nero is the individual that took Christian Ferguson to the hospital because the defendant didn't even bother to go. And when Christian was presented to the doctors, they were alarmed. Significant weight. They will tell you that when a child is 9, they're expected to grow and develop. He was not meeting his growth. In fact, he was suffering. They wanted to do those follow-up appointments. They never happened. This occurred in March of 2003. A lot happened in March of 2003 in that it was the last time several individuals ever saw Christian. Doctors never saw him again. Let's talk about somebody else, very important. Let's talk a little bit about Theda Person, mother. She had visitations with Christian that was facilitated through an agency called the Heritage House. And these occurred on the weekends. She would get him for several hours. On March 22nd and 3, she went to Heritage to have one of these visitations occur. And she will say Christian just didn't look right. He looked tired, lethargic. He just didn't seem right. His usual bubbly self when he saw his mom.
All right, this is the beginning of the prosecution's opening statement. Our next trial out of Missouri. We're going to slip a break in here as we approach the top of the
accept the audio recording of the voicemail message of the defendant has been admitted into evidence and will now be played for you. The transcript of the audio recording is being provided to you to listen to the audio recording. This transcript is not evidence. It is being provided to you to assist you in following the audio recording. You are instructed that the audio recording and not the transcript is the evidence. Should there be any discrepancies between the audio recording and the transcript, you are to be guided by what you hear on the audio recording. Thank you.
Let's get a link to the Rutgers trial. If you little miss, I'll stream it on my second channel, and then we can kind of decide which one.
It's not my channel. I'm streaming somebody else's channel. Stop. Oh. I'm waiting on the news channel to bring it back up. I hate streaming somebody else's shit. And wait back up. Hey. No. Come here. Yeah, come here. Whoever's in here, can you hear me? Yeah. That's the one that's streaming. I don't know why Court TV isn't doing it. They did a premiere, but they're not doing it now. Fuck Brian Laundrie, man. Getting the same shit over and over again. That's not it. I've already seen that.
Good morning, everybody. Can everyone hear me okay? On the morning of June 11th of 2003,
That's how I feel.
Every business starts small, really small, and it can grow.
where the ammonia levels were starting to rise. So she's at the hospital. She's being seen by doctors, and visitation time period ends. Bill will tell you that she leaned in, gave Christian a kiss, said goodbye, without ever knowing that last time she ever saw her little boy. March 22nd of 2003. We talked earlier about those life-sustaining medications that Christian's supposed to be receiving. You'll hear from someone who works at the Children's Hospital Pharmacy. You'll see those records. His medications were supposed to be supplied every 30 days. 30-day supply of these life-sustaining medications. They weren't filled every 30 days. You'll see that on several of them, it was 60 days, 70 days, 80 days. Some of them weren't filled for over 120 plus days. So we talked about how Theta didn't see Christian after March 22nd of that year. Dawan Ferguson did not bring Christian Ferguson to the next visit, or the next one, or the next one, or the ones after that. So Theta filed a motion in family court in St. Louis City to get these visitations to resume. It was scheduled to go to court on June 9th of 2003. June 9th. You will hear from Sharon Williams, Theta's sister. She will tell you that around Memorial Day, she had an interaction with the defendant. So she kind of acted as a go-between between the two. And on this day, at the end of May, it says that the defendant went to her house and was saying things to her like, "Can't you get Theta to drop this? Why do we need to go to court? Can't you just wait till the kids are older?" Things like that. But what she also remembers the defendant her at the end of May, "Theta will get those kids over my dead body." Forward to June 9th. That status conference took place, and the defendant was ordered to resume those visitations immediately or risk held in contempt. 2 days later, on June 11th, is Dawan Ferguson reported that his son Christian was the victim of this alleged carjacking. So let's talk about the events of June 11th, 2003. We talked earlier about how police, law enforcement, several agencies all got involved in an effort to look for Christian. It was broadcast over the news. Everyone was worried about a poor disabled little boy missing. I said earlier how the defendant drive right down here is the intersection of Page and Skinker. Here is where the defendant lives. So from here to here. When the police respond to that intersection at Page and Skinker, the defendant tells them about how his son had been up night vomiting and he was going to take him to the hospital, but he stopped to use a payphone along the way to call ahead. That his expedition was last seen around 6:07 driving east into St. Louis City. I want to direct your attention to where the SUV was recovered. Up here, top of that map, on a little dead-end street called Ron Bar Lane. The expedition was found around 7:50 in the morning, a little less than 2 hours after he made that 911 call. It was found by law enforcement. But you will hear from the residents of that street, they saw that car there in the 5 o'clock hour, around 5 a.m. to 5:15 a.m., about an hour before the defendant made that 911 call. They already saw the expedition there. You'll see what this street looks like. You'll hear from these witnesses. For example, one of them, she will tell you that her boyfriend got up to go to work in the morning. He had to leave around 5 o'clock in the morning. Her bed goes straight up against her window. He leaves, and then he gets back into bed, and she sees headlights coming down. She thinks maybe he looks out. It's the defendant's car. You'll hear from the house that it was parked in front of. He saw it there before 6:07 as well. So as the defendant is claiming his car is being taken at 6:07 a.m., it's already been seen by two individuals on the street where it was abandoned. There's another address on that map. Right here. Half a mile from Rombar Lane is a little street called Disco Drive. And the defendant and his wife Monica had a friend that lived on Disco Drive. And she drove a tan Chevy Malibu. And she will come in and she will tell you that several people had keys to her car, would borrow it, use it, one of them being the defendant. So half a mile from Ronbar Lane, where the expedition was left, is where Lakeisha Mays lives with her tan Chevy Malibu. That Malibu is seen at the intersection of Page and Skinker, parked right around the corner from that payphone where the defendant made that 911 call. Let's talk a little bit about what you will hear in relation to what was occurring in the Ferguson household in the months leading up to, and specifically the night of the disappearance. You will hear from Ferguson, Christer. She will tell you about what was going on at that house, how Christian wasn't being fed, he wasn't being bathed, he wasn't being cared for. She will tell you that when she was 8 years old, she would try to bathe him because no one else was. I may have forgot to mention this earlier, But we talked a lot about how March was the funding for the Medicaid for the at-home nurses ended in March of 2003. So from March of 2003 until no one was in that home caring for Christian. He wasn't being seen by doctors either. He wasn't being seen by his mother. He wasn't being... But Lynn Ferguson was living in that home. She saw Christian. She will say that he was getting skinnier and skinnier. And you could see ribs on his body and his bones. I expect she might say that he looked like Gollum from Lord of the Rings. On the night of June 10th, on the day of June 10th, Lynn notices that Christian's feeding tube is not in his stomach. She saw a little bit of blood. She tells Monica that Christian's feeding tube is not in him. Monica doesn't care. And that night, Lynn was in her room. She shared with Christian. Christian is moaning. She remembers seeing his eyes rolling into the back of his head and seeing the whites of his eyes. She remembers pretending to be asleep when the defendant walks into that room, picks up Christian, and takes Christian into the TV room. She hears Christian moaning. She hears what she describes as a struggle, but she doesn't see it, but she hears it. And then she hears the moaning stop. And then she sees Dawan Ferguson carry a quiet Christian and place him back in bed. Then a short while later, he comes back in the room again, wraps him entirely in a blanket, and carries him out of the room. Lynn Ferguson never saw her brother again after that. Their stepsister, Deshonda, also lived in the home that night too. She remembers getting up in the middle of the night, doesn't know why she's woken up, but gets up at night. She expects it's around 3 or 4 in the morning, goes to the restroom, and as she's leaving the restroom, she sees the defendant exiting from Christian's room, holding Christian, wrapped entirely in a blanket.
That poor child. We're going to hit the pause button here. You're not going to miss a moment of statements in the missing son murder trial. We'll be right back here on Court TV Live.
Re-up now.
Shucks.
This is Court TV Live, your front row seat to justice. I'm Julie Brandt. Thank you for being with us on this Monday. Let's go back in now. More of the opening statement from the prosecution in the state of Missouri in the case against Dawan Ferguson. It's his son who is the victim in this case, and we're hearing about him in this portion of the story being told in the open.
She could not see any part of him, but knew it was him based on the size of the child. And she sees the defendant leave. All of that is in the middle of the night on June 10th, 2000. You will hear that after this 911 call was made and Christian was reported missing, there were several organized searches to try to find him. You will hear that the defendant did not participate in any of them. You will hear from members of the St. Louis City Police Department their extensive efforts in this case, how they called in assistance from the FBI. You will hear from members of the FBI that will testify here as well to their investigative work, the evidence they seized. You will hear from Dr. Dorothy Grange, the geneticist here, Christian's geneticist, who will say that without immediate emergency hospital intervention, Christian Ferguson could not have survived, and that he would have died within 48 hours. Within 48 hours of the disappearance. You will also hear from some other individuals that had conversations with the defendant. You will hear about a woman by the name of Ruth Todd, knew the defendant. defendant and had at one point had a relationship with him. She calls the defendant, talks to the defendant, and asks about Christian. Said, what happened? And he tells her, I did what I had to do. And when she asks, what does that mean? He just stares at her. You will hear from Lakeisha Mays, the individual whose Malibu he used. She called the defendant and asked, why'd you take my car? And he says, you don't need to talk to the police. And you will hear from a woman whose name is Santana Contreras. She worked with Monica, the defendant's then wife, at a store called The Avenue. She will tell you that she became friends with Monica and eventually went out with Monica and Dawan Ferguson, and that they had approached her about becoming involved in a three-way type relationship with them. And Monica eventually tells her a little bit about Christian. And then Dawan starts talking to her about Christian. And Dawan Ferguson tells Miss Contreras things like, that boy was dead before I ever reported him missing. The police would be ridiculous to believe a story like that. We weren't giving him his medication. He talks about his ex-wife, Theda, and how much he hated her. And he said that the police are never going to find that body. Over the next several days, you are going to hear a lot of evidence. You will hear from witnesses. You will hear from police officers, detectives, FBI agents, forensic interviewers, doctors, nurses. It's going to be a lot. Please stay focused and keep your eye on the ball. Don't get distracted by things that aren't important. Focus on the evidence, like we talked about in jury. The things the witnesses say, the physical pieces of evidence, stuff like that. It's going to be a lot, and we're asking a lot of you, but please stay focused. The defendant is charged in this case with murder in the first degree for knowingly causing the death of Christian Ferguson after deliberation. And he is also charged in the with child abuse resulting in death by failing to provide Christian Ferguson with the necessary medication and nutrition that ultimately resulted in his death. And at the close of all of the evidence, I will ask that you find the defendant guilty of murder. Thank you.
No.
Find some breathing room. On NerdWallet,